Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, March 29th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Riverside is set for quite a warm day with a high of 91.8 degrees and a low of 70.7, so make sure to keep cool out there. It is a beautiful Easter Sunday, so to those who celebrate, a very happy holiday to you. We have a lot to unpack today. We are examining the volatile situation in the Middle East and the factors placing the region on the brink of a major conflict. We are also looking at the intense financial scrutiny currently facing those vying for the governor's seat in California. Plus, we will have a look at other important stories from around the globe. There is plenty to cover, so stick with us as we get you up to speed. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a rapidly deteriorating situation across the Middle East. Yemen's Houthi rebels launched their first direct ballistic missile attack against Israel just yesterday, and that's only part of a much larger crisis unfolding right now. Ethan covers international security for us and has been tracking every development. Ethan, what exactly happened yesterday?
So yesterday, March 28th, the Houthis fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at what they called sensitive military sites in southern Israel. Al Jazeera and the Grand Pinnacle Tribune both report the targets were near Beersheba and Israel's primary nuclear research center. Houthi military spokesperson Brigadier General Yahya Sari confirmed the attack himself. He framed it as a, quote, support operation, end quote, for what Iran and its allies call the axis of resistance.
That sounds terrifying for people on the ground. Did any of those missiles actually hit?
Remarkably, no ABC News in the Times of Israel reported that air raid sirens blared across southern Israel, but the Arrow 3 defense system intercepted every projectile. There were no casualties and no reported damage. But the sheer scale of the launch was enough for Israel to declare a nationwide state of emergency, which tells you how seriously they're taking this new threat.
So what provoked the Houthis to go this far?
They were very explicit about their reasoning. According to Middle East Eye and The Guardian, the Houthis pointed directly to massive Israeli and American airstrikes carried out on March 27th. Those strikes hit Iranian nuclear facilities and government infrastructure. They also struck positions in Lebanon that killed health workers and journalists, which drew international condemnation. The Houthis essentially said they were retaliating on behalf of the broader alliance.
Now, this isn't the first time the Houthis have struck Israel, right?
It's not, though yesterday was a dramatic escalation. CBS News and the New York Times have noted that the Houthis' first successful direct hit on Israeli soil was back on July 19, 2024. That was a modified Iranian drone called the Jaffa that struck an apartment building in Tel Aviv and killed one civilian. Israel responded with Operation Outstretched Arm, hitting the port of Al-Hudaydah. But what we saw yesterday is a completely different level. A shift from isolated drone strikes to coordinated ballistic missile warfare designed to overwhelm Israel's layered defenses.
Let's back up to the bigger picture. This all seems to trace back to a major operation against Iran's leadership about a month ago.
Exactly, and it's hard to overstate how significant that was. On February 28th, a joint U.S.-Israeli operation struck a high-level security meeting in Tehran. The Washington Post and The Guardian both confirmed that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strike. The commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, Mohammad Pakpour, and Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh were also killed. The operation had two names depending on who you ask: Operation Epic Fury on the American side and Shield of Judah on the Israeli side.
How did Israel's leadership respond publicly to that?
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was blunt. He said, quote, "The head of the octopus has been removed," end quote. That language was very deliberate, framing Iran as the central threat whose tentacles reach into Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. Then just 2 days ago, on March 27th, follow-up strikes targeted the Shahid Khandab heavy water complex and the Ardakan yellowcake plant. The Jerusalem Post and JINSA report that Israel now claims what it calls a functional collapse of Iran's power projection, asserting that 85% of Iranian air defenses and 90% of its missile launch capabilities have been destroyed.
With all that military pressure, where do diplomatic efforts stand?
They're struggling, honestly. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, put forward a 15-point ceasefire proposal. The Wall Street Journal and Fox News reported on the key demands. The plan calls for total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, a complete ban on uranium enrichment, and the abandonment of the entire Axis of Resistance proxy network, including Hezbollah and the Houthis. It also demands strict limits on ballistic missile ranges and the guaranteed reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
What would Iran get in return under that proposal?
The U.S. offered to lift all nuclear-related sanctions and provide assistance building a civilian nuclear energy program. On paper, that's a significant economic incentive, but Iran International and CGTN reported that Tehran rejected the plan outright on March 25th. Iranian officials called it a demand for, quote, surrender, end quote, which gives you a sense of how far apart the two sides really are.
Did Iran offer any kind of counter?
They did. Tehran came back with a 5-point proposal of its own. It demanded war reparations for the damage done to its infrastructure, sovereignty over regional waterways, and most pointedly, a complete cessation of what they called assassinations. So you've got one side demanding total disarmament and the other side demanding compensation for being attacked. The gap between those positions is enormous.
So that brings us to the summit happening right now in Islamabad. What's the goal there?
NPR and The Hindu report that Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is hosting an emergency summit today with top diplomats from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. The immediate objective is to secure a 30-day humanitarian pause. That pause would serve two purposes: stabilizing global markets and getting desperately needed aid into Lebanon and Iran. The UN and the Norwegian Refugee Council are warning of a humanitarian disaster affecting hundreds of thousands of civilians in both countries.
Is there a hard deadline driving the urgency?
There is, and it's close. President Trump has set a moratorium on strikes against Iran's energy infrastructure, but it expires on April 6th, just 8 days from now. If the Strait of Hormuz isn't reopened by 8 p.m. Eastern Time that day, the United States has vowed a full-scale assault on Iran's oil and gas sectors. That's not an abstract threat. It would essentially cripple what's left of Iran's economy and send shockwaves through global energy markets.
Speaking of markets, how is this already affecting the global economy?
It's been devastating. The S&P 500 just posted its worst week since this war began. Brent crude has spiked past $113 a barrel, and that's with the Strait of Hormuz already closed. Now layer on the Houthi threat to block the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well, and you're looking at a dual choke point crisis. Nearly 30% of Israel's imports flow through those corridors. Roughly $1 trillion in annual global goods are at risk if both waterways stay shut down.
What about the human cost so far?
The numbers are staggering and climbing. More than 1,900 people have been killed in Iran, and over 1,100 in Lebanon. 19 have died in Israel. On the American side, at least 13 U.S. troops were killed and dozens more wounded when Iran launched a retaliatory strike on the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Military.com reports that 2,500 Marines and 1,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division have now been deployed to the region to secure critical infrastructure.
So with the Houthis now actively firing ballistic missiles at Israel, what does that change going forward?
It changes the math considerably. Before yesterday, the Houthis were a proxy nuisance, disruptive but manageable. Now they're a direct belligerent, capable of launching coordinated ballistic missile strikes. That forces Israel and the U.S. to defend against threats from multiple directions simultaneously: Iran to the east, Lebanon to the north, and Yemen to the south. It also creates that dual choke point problem I mentioned, with both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb potentially blocked. Diplomats in Islamabad are working urgently, but the window is narrowing fast with that April 6th deadline just over a week away.
Ethan, thank you for walking us through all of that. We'll be following the Islamabad summit closely in the days ahead.
Thanks, Grace.
We turn now to the California governor's race, where mandatory tax disclosures are painting a vivid picture of the wealth gap among candidates. Chloe has been following this one closely. Chloe, what are we learning from these filings?
So California has this transparency law called Senate Bill 27. It requires every gubernatorial candidate to hand over 5 years of federal tax returns to the Secretary of State at least 98 days before the primary. Cal Matters reports that candidates must submit an unredacted copy for state records and a redacted version the public can actually see. The whole idea is to flag potential conflicts of interest before voters head to the polls. And these filings have absolutely dominated the conversation in this race.
Now, the California Supreme Court struck down a similar requirement for presidential candidates. Why does it still apply here?
That's a great question. The court ruling you're thinking of is Patterson versus Padilla, which specifically targeted the presidential disclosure mandate. But according to Cal Matters, the law remains legally binding for state executive offices like governor, so every major candidate in this race had to comply. Governor Newsom signed this into law back in 2019, and it's now reshaping how voters evaluate the field.
And the big headline seems to be billionaire Tom Steyer. What do his returns show?
Steyer's numbers are eye-popping. According to Cal Matters and the New York Times, he and his wife, Kat Taylor, reported $39 million in income for 2024, mostly from global stock investments. That single figure exceeds the combined earnings of all 9 of his major opponents and their spouses. He paid $5.4 million in federal taxes that year. And his income swings wildly from year to year, ranging from a high of $160 million in 2021 down to what he'd probably call a low of $8 million in 2022.
And there's a new wrinkle involving offshore income that just came to light yesterday?
Right. Just yesterday, on March 28th, we learned that Steyer reported about $6 million in passive income from offshore entities. We're talking Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands. Cal Matters reports those holdings trace back to funds tied to his former firm, Farallon Capital. Political analysts told Cal Matters they expect his rivals to hammer him on this in the coming weeks, especially because it clashes with his campaign theme of shared prosperity. Republican Steve Hilton and Democrat Antonio Villaraigosa have already gone after his hedge fund background.
Speaking of Hilton, he's also reporting some serious income. Where's his money coming from?
Hilton's household reported $7.5 million in 2024 income and paid $2.8 million in federal taxes. But here's the interesting part. Hilton himself earned about $250,000 from his media work as a former Fox News commentator. The vast majority of that household income, about $6.7 million, came from his wife Rachel Whetstone. She's the chief communications officer at Netflix. So in his case, the spousal earnings really dominate the picture.
And Villaraigosa, the former LA mayor? How does he compare?
He's a tier below Steyer and Hilton, but still doing quite well. He reported $1.4 million in 2024 income and paid $462,000 in federal taxes. Most of that money came from consulting firms, Actum and his own Antonio Villaraigosa LLC. He also pulls in a $125,000 annual pension from his years in local government. So he's in a comfortable spot financially, though nowhere near the billionaire class.
Let's talk about the candidates in the middle of the pack. There are several sitting officials in this race. What do their returns look like?
This is where it gets really interesting, because you see the contrast with Steyer's wealth. Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco reported $590,000 in joint income for 2025. Cal Matters notes he's the highest paid sheriff in the state and possibly the entire country, with a base salary of $348,000 and a total compensation package that's previously topped $593,000. He and his wife paid $127,000 in federal taxes. Then you've got San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan at $507,000, which combines his $226,000 mayoral salary with his wife Sylvia's $267,000 as a high school president.
What about the federal officials in the race?
Xavier Becerra, the U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary, reported $490,000 in 2024. That's his $250,000 federal salary plus $110,000 in net profit from 4 rental properties. He and his wife, who's a physician, paid $116,000 in taxes. Congressman Eric Swalwell came in at $461,000, blending his $184,000 congressional salary with his wife Brittany's $247,000 in consulting income. They paid $83,000 in federal taxes, so these are solidly upper-middle-class households by California standards.
Now, one candidate is really leaning into a working-class message. That's State Superintendent Tony Thurmond.
Yeah, Thurmond's taking a very different approach. He reported $309,000 in 2025 income, but what's grabbing attention is a side job. He disclosed roughly $18,000 from working as a disability supportive living aide at Integrated Community Services. The San Diego Voice and Cal Matters both report that Thurmond says his $203,000 state salary isn't enough to cover the cost of living in California for his family. He's built his whole campaign narrative around having the lived experience of a working-class person.
That's a bold claim on a $200,000 salary. Has it drawn any pushback?
It absolutely has. He received a warning from the Fair Political Practices Commission over what's called a behested payment tied to a side job at a food pantry, and some union-adjacent groups have called him hypocritical for saying his salary is inadequate when he oversees state workers earning far less. It's a tricky line to walk, using financial struggle as a campaign theme when your base salary already puts you well above the state median.
What about Katie Porter? She made a name for herself with that whiteboard in Congress.
Porter reported $300,000 in 2025 income, almost entirely from her salary as a law professor at UC Irvine. What's notable is her book, Royalty Trajectory. She pulled in $140,000 in royalties back in 2023. But by 2025, that figure had dropped to just $3,500. She paid $58,000 in federal taxes, so she's solidly in the professional class, but a far cry from the top earners in this field.
And former state controller Betty Yee rounds out the lower end?
She does. Yee reported $211,000 in 2024, mostly from pensions and Social Security. She and her husband paid just $24,000 in federal taxes. It underscores a real generational divide in this race. You've got a retiree living on pensions competing against a billionaire investor who made $39 million in a single year.
Now, this transparency law has already knocked someone off the ballot. What happened there?
Green Party candidate Rudolph Ware, who goes by Butch, was disqualified from the primary ballot by Secretary of State Shirley Weber on March 16th. He failed to submit correctly redacted tax returns by the deadline. The errors were things like leaving a personal phone number visible and inconsistencies in business names. It sounds minor, but the law is very specific about what has to be redacted.
And he challenged that in court?
He did. Ware filed a lawsuit, Ware versus Weber, alleging a conspiracy by the Democratic establishment. He argued the Secretary of State gave him an impossible 10-minute window to fix clerical errors. But just 3 days ago, on March 26th, Sacramento Superior Court Judge James Arguelles rejected the petition. The judge ruled the Secretary of State had made a reasonable effort to work with Ware, and that he simply didn't comply with the law. SF Gate and Cal Matters report that Ware plans to appeal and pursue a federal civil rights lawsuit.
So is he completely out of the race?
Not entirely. SB 27 explicitly exempts write-in candidates from the tax disclosure requirement, so Ware can still run as a write-in in the June 2nd primary. He's announced he intends to do exactly that while pursuing his legal challenges. It's a steep uphill climb, but he's not giving up.
The field has already gotten smaller, even without the legal drama, right?
It has. Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis and former Senate leader Tony Atkins both dropped out in late 2025. Kounalakis shifted over to the state treasurer's race, and Atkins cited a lack of a viable path to victory. So the lane has narrowed, but the financial contrasts have only gotten sharper as a result.
With the June primary approaching, how are these disclosures shaping the campaign overall?
The middle-income candidates are essentially weaponizing their own tax returns. They're pointing to their relatively modest earnings as proof they understand what regular Californians face. Meanwhile, Steyer and Hilton have to explain why voters should trust candidates whose household incomes are measured in the millions or tens of millions. The offshore income revelation about Steyer especially gives his opponents fresh ammunition. CalMatters political analysts say the next few weeks will test whether financial transparency actually changes voter behavior or just gives campaigns new talking points.
Chloe, great breakdown. Thanks for walking us through all of that.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Millions of citizens decided it was time to rein in executive power this weekend, as the No Kings rallies drew a massive crowd of 8 million participants across 3,300 locations worldwide. At the national flagship event in St. Paul, Minnesota, the boss, Bruce Springsteen, was born to run the protest, debuting a new anthem titled Streets of Minneapolis. The song was a heartfelt tribute to Renee Good and Alex Preddy, two local residents who lost their lives during a recent federal immigration crackdown. This movement, coordinated by Indivisible and the No Kings Coalition, is taking aim at Operation Metro Surge and military actions in Iran, while advocating for state-level No Kings acts to hold federal officers civilly liable for constitutional violations. While most events were peaceful, the situation in Los Angeles brought many to tears when authorities deployed gas against approximately 250 protesters during a tactical alert at a federal detention center. This historic mobilization marks the largest single-day protest in modern history, coinciding with the launch of Springsteen's Land of Hope and Dreams tour and critical legislative deadlines for police accountability in Maryland and California. In North Korea, the military is looking for a solid foundation for its strategic goals. On March 29, 2026, leader Kim Jong-un observed a successful test of a newly upgraded, high-thrust solid-fuel engine designed to give their intercontinental ballistic missiles a real boost. Constructed from composite carbon fiber, the engine reached a maximum thrust of 2,500 kilotons, a significant step up from the 1,971 kilotons recorded last September. While Pyongyang hopes to muscle its way into having a more agile and stealthy way to target the United States mainland with multiple warheads, some analysts suggest they may be overthrusting their claims, as the technical hurdles of atmospheric re-entry remain a heated debate. Over at the Vatican, a new chapter is unfolding in the Holy See. Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pontiff, presided over Palm Sunday Mass in St. Peter's Square. He used his inaugural Holy Week homily to honor the memory of Pope Francis, who passed away on Easter Monday last year, and to issue a stern rejection of using religion to justify the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran, as well as the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Leo is also walking the walk by shifting liturgical traditions, moving the Holy Thursday foot-washing ritual back to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, defining his papacy by diverging from his predecessor's prison visits. In the halls of justice, a 98-year-old judge is hoping for a supreme comeback. Judge Pauline Newman has appealed to the Supreme Court after a 3-year suspension, arguing that her colleagues' decision to bar her from hearing cases is a shadow impeachment that bypasses Congress. Her legal team from the New Civil Liberties Alliance argues that this is a major test of the Good Behavior Clause of the Constitution, forcing a decision on how the federal judiciary handles its more seasoned members and whether administrative bodies can sideline dissenting voices. Finally, the digital front is heating up as Iranian-linked hackers have launched a web of attacks against critical infrastructure. A massive data wiping operation against medical giant Stryker disabled nearly 80,000 devices, proving to be a real headache for Michigan healthcare. In a move that is truly clickbait, hackers even distributed a fake bomb shelter app to install spyware on the phones of those fleeing missile strikes. With over 50 groups active, these hackers are proving that they can wipe the floor with civilian supply chains by launching destructive ransomware that demands no payment at all, favoring pure chaos over profit. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.